This video is sponsored by Skillshare. Learn more about Skillshare and the exclusive offer they have for our viewers at the end of the video. In the late 2nd century BC, Rome had defeated and subjugated Greece and Macedonia, wiped Carthage from existence, and had delivered the Seleucid Empire a devastating blow. Its fortunes seemed to be ever increasing, but problems were growing slowly. The stress of ever-increasing warfare and wealth division in their society was threatening to tear the Republic apart. On top of this, the militia army of the earlier Republic was stagnating and becoming inadequate for facing new enemies due to a lack of manpower. Soon a threat from the north would emerge that would necessitate the complete overhaul of the Roman military into what was essentially the first Roman imperial army. Welcome to our video on the Marian reforms of the late Republic. In 113 BC, a roaming army of Germanic warriors crossed Rome's border on the Danube, driven by unlivable climate conditions in their homeland. For the next few years, they rampaged around Roman territory and defeated a few Roman armies. In 105 BC, they crushed an army of 80,000 legionaries at Arausio, after which the situation became critical. The Roman people were terrified and expected the Germanic hordes at the gates of Rome at any time. It seemed as though the Republic might fall until one man returned to take command: Gaius Marius. He had just finished the Jugurthine War against the Numidians and was elected consul in absentia during the year 105 BC. Upon his return to Rome, he began to drastically alter the military in order to combat this new threat. His reforms would have a wide-ranging impact both on the legions and the state of Rome. It is worth noting that not all of his changes were novel. Generals before Marius had paved the way for them and had partaken in various different tactics before this time, such as the reduction of the baggage train. Marius, however, both created new methods for the Roman army and permanently instituted the effective methods of the other commanders who had come before him. Until Marius's reforms, there was a property requirement to join the citizen militia legions. This limited the number of legionaries, as they had to supply their own arms and armour and had to own property valued at 3,500 sesterces or more. Perhaps the most important reform implemented by Marius was to ignore this property requirement. He allowed the Capitae Censi of Rome to join the legions, those counted by the head. The landless poor were now among the ranks of those who could join the legions, even though they had no property. On top of, and because of this, Marius arranged for the state to supply the legions with their arms and armour, offered poor recruits the chance to gain a professional soldier's pay, and the chance to gain loot and plunder on campaign. The masses, with little hope of gaining status in any other occupation, flocked to Marius's new legions. In contrast to the earlier Roman policy in which the citizen army would disband after a campaign, recruits were now enlisted for a term of 16 years. This created a standing Roman army for the first time, and drastically increased its quality. On the other hand, the balanced cross-sectional army of the Roman people at war was destroyed, in favour of an army made up mainly of the landless poor, the proletarii. This would eventually have grave consequences for the Republic, as the poor soldiers became loyal to their generals rather than to the Roman state. While this seems like a landmark change, it is also possible that these reforms were just the final stage in an already occurring gradual decline in property requirements for the Roman army. The organisation of the various Roman units was also completely changed in these reforms. The early maniple system was last recorded being used in the Battle of Muthul in the Jugurthine War of 109 BC. As the system had become obsolete and needed replacement, the Romans did away with it without sentimentality. By 104 BC, Marius had discarded 4 of the 5 legionary standards which had been used for command and control purposes. the Minotaur, Horse, Boar, and Wolf. Only one remained, the Aquila or Eagle. This is when the Roman eagle standard became the emblem of the Roman legions. To replace the maniples as the primary tactical unit of the Roman military, the cohort was adopted. Compared to the 120-strong maniple, a standard Republican cohort was a larger 600-strong unit, comprised of 6 centuries. 480 of these men were legionaries, whereas the other 120 were non-combatants, either servants, slaves, or tactical support personnel such as engineers. The component unit, the Roman century, was a 100-strong unit commanded by a centurion. In this unit, 80 men served as legionaries and 20 men were non-combatants. There was also no designated military commander of a cohort itself, and it is widely believed that either the most senior centurion took command, or the 6 centurions commanded together as a council. The smallest and most personal unit in this system was the contubernium. This was comprised of 10 men commanded by an officer called a decanus. 8 men were legionaries and only 2 were non-combatants. 10 contubernia made up a century and 6 centuries made up a cohort. It was 10 of these new military divisions which made up a new Roman legion of around 6,000 men, with 4,800 legionaries and 1,200 non-combatants. The abolition of the manipular system also abolished the 3 distinct lines of infantry of the mid-republic. The Hastati, Principes and Triarii were removed, and instead 3 lines of infantry equipped similarly to the earlier Principes were adopted. The form of triplex acies used in the Marian legion was different to the one implemented prior to it. Cohorts were a solid unit with only small gaps in between them, compared to the previous maniple system with larger gaps. This, along with the increased depth of the new cohorts, reduced the tendency of the soldiers to panic and flee, as they would feel they had more support and were safe. The legions were now on their way to becoming the force of popular imagination, a homogeneous force of heavy infantry armed with the gladius as their primary weapon, and a dagger called the pugio as a sidearm. These new uniform warriors were all named Legionarii. Their equipment mostly remained the same, but some tweaks were made. The iron shank of the pilum javelin was previously attached to the wooden shaft by 2 nails. However, Marius replaced one of the nails with a less sturdy wooden peg. On impact, the peg would snap, rendering the pilum useless and bending the shank at a right angle, making the enemy even more encumbered by the impaling of their shields. As for protection, the Legionarii wore a helmet, body armor and greaves. Their main protection, however, was still the large scutum shield, which covered the soldier from shoulder to shin. A legionary would also bash and batter opponents with this shield, despite its weight. In this way, it could be just as offensive as his blade. The 1,200 non-combat attendants may seem like a lot of support personnel at first glance, but it is important to remember the key role of logistics in warfare. Without food, animals, fuel and maintenance, an army could not function. The reforms did not ignore logistics, and the creation of Marius's mules was a perfect example of this. Under Marius, legionaries began to carry all of their equipment themselves, rather than relying on a cumbersome baggage train. This had many positive impacts for the operations of the army. The soldiers themselves became conditioned by their heavy load, with the physical training increasing their endurance during combat. In addition, the soldiers carrying their own entrenching equipment allowed for the rapid construction of fortifications, camps and earthworks. Finally, the lack of a massive baggage train also allowed the legions to move extremely quickly compared to their prior speed. The only drawbacks were the complaints from the legionaries about their new heavy workload, becoming referred to as Marius's mules, named so for their heavy packs. As the Republic progressed, the unpopular nature of horsemanship